In this lesson and the next few lessons, we're going to be considering the topic of macroeconomics. And the purpose at the start here is to give a preview of this really amazing part of economics. One thing you should be aware of at the start, this is sort of thinking about things from a broader perspective, a big picture, I think of it sometimes. So think of it visibly. Put your big picture glasses on. They don't have to be sunglasses, of course, but we're going to be looking at things somewhat differently, somewhat bigger, if you like, than we have when we looked at individual firms, individual consumers, individual workers. They're, of course, going to fit into these ideas of macroeconomics, but how we put them in is going to require this big picture view of the world. Macroeconomics has different topics than micro. It has different models than microeconomics. The topics we're going to be considering in the macro part of those discussions are economic growth. That's the tendency for the economy to expand over long periods of time, or for some economies to go more rapidly than others, and some go more slower than others. But we also want to consider the ups and downs in the economy, the recessions and the recoveries. So that's the fluctuations, it's sometimes called. When we look at the growth and fluctuations, we need to look at some economic variables. And here's a list. We're going to look at gross domestic product, GDP. We're going to actually look more carefully at this important idea today. We also want to look at things like the unemployment rate, the inflation rate, the interest rate, and the exchange rate. We want to talk about how those fit into the macroeconomy. Once you do that, you're able to examine and think about other kinds of policies, such as monetary policy, what the central bank of the country does, how much money it supplies, how it sets interest rates. In the United States, the central bank is called the Federal Reserve. How the Federal Reserve should operate is an important question for public policy. Fiscal policy is another topic for macroeconomics. If the economy goes into a recession, should there be a stimulus package? Or is there another policy that's more appropriate? And what about the deficit and the debt that may rise because of actions like that? What is the impact of that on the economy? Those are all issues about fiscal policy. When we think about these questions, we need to have some kind of a model. Just when you consider antitrust policy or regulation of industries, you need some kind of model of the firm. Maybe it has monopolistic competition. Similarly, when you consider monetary policy or fiscal policy, you need a model. And this time, though, we need a model of the whole economy, how things are working as a whole. Building up aggregation from many markets, whether it's the toy market or the market for pumpkins or markets for bracelets, whatever it happens to be. This model of the whole economy also has to be dynamic, because after all, growth is what happens as an economy expands over time. And these ups and downs in the economy represent things over time. So the dynamic things are important in these models. We also want to think about equilibrium in these models. Just as we considered equilibrium in the supply and demand model, the intersection of supply and demand, we need some concept of equilibrium here to see whether our model settles down, whether it explains the reality. It's called general equilibrium because it considers all markets in the economy, not just the bracelet market or the pumpkin market or the bicycle market. These kinds of ideas and models are really important, as you can imagine. What a country has for its fiscal policy, for its debt policy, for its deficit, what it does for monetary policy is extraordinarily important for the well-being of people. I find it fascinating, and I hope you do too, how amazingly an entire economy can be described by a relatively simple model. It's how we do that, how well we do it is really, to me, a fascinating thing. Hope I can convey that to you. This is an area which is also controversial, probably more so than other parts of economics, partly because we can't really test our theories as well as we can in microeconomic examples. There's only one big recession, one great recession. We can't really replay policy or try out another one. So it's controversial, and I think it's particularly controversial these days. People on different sides, should you have a stimulus package, should you not? Should the Federal Reserve be very expansionary, should it not? There's people whose views range quite widely, and you can see this in the public policy debates. But what's the most important, I think, for studying the subject is try to get an understanding of why economists differ. And a lot of that has to do with the different models of the economy they have, and also how they interpret the variables, such as the unemployment rate, et cetera. So let's get started with this. In order to think about the economy and the variables and what's happening, you have to have some way to measure the economy, just like you can measure the temperature, measure the humidity in the economy, in the climate, whatever happens to be in a country or an area. So you want to kind of find a way to measure what the overall economy is doing. I think it's a lot of fun to do this, as you'll see. I hope, again, I can convey this to you. But quite frankly, it's important for businesses. If you go out and give a talk to a group of business people, they want to know what's happening to the economy. It affects their business, it affects their products, it affects their markets. It's also, of course, important for personal investment decisions. Should you invest in this sector, or should you hold off because the economy may not be working so well? Labor market decisions. Should you take a job now or stay in school? That has to do with the state of the economy. You have to kind of think about it and measure what's going on in labor markets, what's going on in the economy as a whole. Looking at the data, measuring the economy is also part of how you understand how the economy works. It's not just the models, it's really understanding the patterns, getting a sense of the magnitudes, what happens generally over time. It's also important to sort out various claims. In the political system, we see ads for one candidate or another. Incumbents are going to claim that the responsibility for a bad economy, say, is due to other things than them. Going to try to claim credit for the good. If the challengers are going to say the bad economy is due to the current leaders. So there's going to be this back and forth naturally in the political system. Knowing, in a sense, what's going on in the economy, measuring it helps you sort out those differences. And of course, to make public policy decisions, whether the chair of the Federal Reserve or the President of the United States deciding exactly what policy to take has to have some sense of what's going on. And then finally, forecasting is important. It's difficult to do, but you can't forecast something if you can't measure it. And you can't forecast what economic growth will be next year if you can't measure what economic growth means. So it's very important for all these perspectives. And I have a little example about the forecasting as you can see how important it gets. This is an example of Alan Greenspan, who was the chair of the Fed in the 80s and 90s and into the early 2000s. And way back when he had a sense of where the economy was, a good economist. And in 1990, he made the statement, this is a quote, that the economy has not yet slipped into a recession. That statement was made on October 2nd, 1990, a long time ago, but it gives us a chance to look at what actually was happening at that point. And indeed, we didn't know then, but we know now that a recession had already begun. It was already underway. It began before October 1990, back in July. So this is another reason. Even the best of economists sometimes get the forecast wrong, don't even know we're in a recession when we are in a recession. Examples of why it is so important to pay attention to how you measure recessions, what recessions are. Thank you.